In this video, I'll be showing you the vertical lookup or VLOOKUP function in Excel. It's maybe the most commonly used yet simplest function for an analyst. Think of it as like the find function, where it will find an item, but then, really importantly, it will look to the right of that item and bring back data associated with it. It's mainly used for two purposes. Firstly, as a quick way to extract summary data from a long top to bottom list. And secondly, to merge data from two lists where one column of data is in a different table to another. So I've got quite a long list here. It's a list of groceries. And what I want to be able to do is bring back as a summary the pound amount for an item that I put into this cell here. So just by way of example, I'm going to type in almonds. And using the VLOOKUP function, I want it to pull back the pound amount for almonds from this list. Now, I know if I've got it right, it should bring back 50. So over here, let's use the FX button to start entering our arguments. So first of all, we'll look for the VLOOKUP function. Select. You'll see those four arguments there. The first argument is the lookup value. So I can either type almonds here, or I can actually have it reference to this K4 cell, which I'm going to do. Table array. This is basically the range of cells from which you're trying to retrieve data from. So you need to make sure that in your table, the first column contains the item you're looking for. So this will be starting over here. I'm going to highlight all this data in my cell range. Column index number. So that's from which column do you want to extract the data. Now I've labeled my columns, so I can see that's column number 4. The first column of your table obviously being column number 1. So I'm going to put in 4. The range lookup, you really only need to put in one or two things here, true or false. Sometimes you might see 0, but that's the same as putting false. So if you put false, it means you're looking for an exact match. And if you're putting true, you're looking for an approximate match. And I'll tell you a bit more about that later. But for now, I want it to exactly look up almonds. So I'm going to put false. 9 times out of 10, you're going to put false and press OK. So you can see that it's brought back 50 as my pound amount by looking up to my table. So let's just do that again. Instead of using the FX function, I'm going to just type in my formula. So pound amount, I can under there I can put equals V, press tab. You'll see it shows you the arguments that you need to put in. So my lookup value this time, rather than referencing to K4, I'm actually just going to type in here almonds. It will look up text, but you just need to make sure you put it in quotes. So look for almonds in the table. So this is the range, making sure that almonds is in the first column that I'm highlighting. Next, column index number. Well, I know that I want column number 4. Range lookup, I want an exact match to almonds, so I'm going to put false. And you can see it brings back the 50. So now let's look at an example using approximate match. And this time, by way of example, I want to look for 55 in the same table. And you can see in the pound amount column, you can see I've already sorted the pound amount column in ascending order. And that's really important because when you use the approximate match method, you're going to get the wrong answer unless you do that. And you'll see why in a minute. So looking at only a singular column, I'm going to this time input the formula, but instead of selecting false for an exact match, I'm going to select true for an approximate match. And Excel will return the largest value that is smaller than 55 that I'm looking up. So let's type here the formula. I'm going to type equals V, I'm going to look up 55. I want to do it from this time just from this single column. And the column index number this time is just going to be 1. It's the first column and only column of what I'm looking at. And the range lookup this time I'm going to put in true, because this time I want an approximate match. And you can see it's returning 51 as the answer. What it actually does is it moves down this column one by one looking for the 55. And as soon as it goes past the 55 without finding it, it goes back one cell. That's why you need it in ascending order. Otherwise, you're going to get a random result. So it goes to 51, says this is not a match, goes to the next cell down to 65. It sees that that's higher than what it's looking for, and then it goes back one cell to 51. If you'd actually asked for an exact match, it would actually return an error. So you can also use the approximate match with text. And let's have another example here where I want to look for cola. So we need to sort the table by item in ascending alphabetical order, which I've already done. So now I'm going to type in my formula over here. So you're probably getting the hang of this by now. I type equals VLOOKUP tab, and I want to look up this time cola, and I want to look for it from the first column, column 1 here, but I want to extract the pound, so I need to at least go over to the pound column. I'm going to go over here. There's my table array. Then column index number, I want column 4. And this time I want to have an approximate match. So I'm going to type in here true, my range lookup. It pulls back 90. So let's have a look at why it's pulling back 90. Well, it starts looking at almonds, which doesn't start with a C, obviously, and it moves down and down and down until it gets to Coke. And it moves then onto crisps. It sees that crisps is alphabetically more than Coke, and so then it moves back to Coke. And so that's why it's returning this value here of 90. So that's how you use approximate match versus exact match. In reality, you're always going to be using the exact match, and it's very infrequently you use approximate match. So VLOOKUP can also be used to bring in lots of data from other data sets or lists. Here you can see I'm missing all my returns data, and it's actually contained on this other tab, returns, here. So if you note between these two sheets, they're in different orders. This is in alphabetical order, and my grocery sales sheet is in a completely different order. So let's fill in returns data using a VLOOKUP. So I'm going to this time type in the formula rather than using the FX button. So equals VLOOKUP tab. So I want to look up my item from And this time I'll go to the returns sheet. I'm going to select this range of cells from the return sheet. Note when I'm doing this that it's saying 4 rows by 3 columns, and as you move down it's telling you how many rows of cells you're highlighting. Well, what's really important is the columns, so I know how far over or the column index number that I want to look for. So we know that the returns data is in the 3rd column of this range. So my column range is going to be 3 if you look up here, and I want to use an exact match, so I take false. So just have a quick look at that syntax over here. So it's looking up my item from the other tab, the returns tab, from that cell range, the 3rd column, and it wants an exact match. So to populate the rest of this column, I can actually just drag that down. However, what you can see is you get lots of NAs. Now, the reason why it's putting in these NAs is because when you drag down this reference, it's a dynamic reference. So it's going to keep moving this cell range on the returns table as well as the lookup value of the item. I want it to change the lookup value. The B4, I want it to change every time. Keep looking up what's in this row, but I don't want it to change the cell range from the returns table. So what you can actually do is make it an absolute reference by putting in a $sign. So you can either manually do that by typing in $, or you can use the F4 function to put that in, but I'm just going to manually put that in. So I've made that cell range now an absolute reference. So you'll see that when I pull this down, that because of those $signs, it's going to not come back with an error because it isn't changing the cell range reference. Perhaps the best way of doing a lookup like this to another table is to actually define the returns data as a table itself. So to do that, I want to highlight the data on the returns tab and then press insert up here and then table, and you'll be able to see that it automatically then will pick up that range. If you've highlighted it, that's the range I want as my table to define. My table does have headers, so I'll have that as ticked and press OK. Then define this as a table. You can see up here it has a table name. So then if I go back to my grocery sales, I input my formula equals VLOOKUP my item from my returns table. You can see it's put in there table 4, it knows the name of that table. Bring back column 3, and I want an exact match false. You then see that if you drag this formula down, it's not going to come back with NAs because it's always looking at that table. So the other good thing about this is you can insert rows to your table, and it's going to pick that up as the full table, and it's not going to leave out new items inserted. So always defining the table is a good practice to get into. Now, looking at the numbers it's pulled back, you can see that for Coke, there are 2 Cokes, and it's pulled back 9 in the returns column for both of these Cokes. If we have a quick look at the returns column, you can actually see one of them, the 2 litres, should be 9, and the 1 litre should be 4. So the reason why it's doing this is because it is getting to the first Coke on that returns table, then it's bringing back the returns for that first Coke, and it's doing that for both of these because it doesn't keep going. It just stops at the first Coke it gets to and brings back the return. So that's a bit of a drawback of the VLOOKUP function, and the way to get around this is to have a unique identifier column. So the way you put that in is by using the AND function. So equals my item and my subcategory. Pull that down. And you can see for things like bananas, which appears more than once, it's also going to bring in the subcategory, and this makes it a unique identifier. This is now a unique identifying column. If I now change the VLOOKUP to be on this column, as long as I've done the same unique identifier to, let's fix that typo, to my other table, you should get the right data. So on this returns table, let's put in a unique identifier here. Again, and drag it down. And you can see that it's picking up these as unique. So everything now in this column is unique. So if I go back to where I'm trying to populate returns, if I want these Coke numbers to come back with the right numbers instead of both the same number 9, I can change my formula to, instead of looking up this column, item column, I'll get it to look up my unique identifier column, and this time I want it to, first of all, my first column be the unique identifier column over here. So you can see again that it's telling me that it's 4 columns across. Then under my cursor, 9 rows by 4 columns in this instance, which goes up to the rows, but it's 4 columns across is the returns data. So this time, because we've inserted that column up here, I will need to put in 4. And this time, don't forget to put in those dollars. You want it to be an absolute reference. Drag it down. It should bring back for the Cokes the different returns. So you can see, so this Coke here, it's brought back 4 for the 1 litre and 9 for the 2 litres. And that's because now it's looking at that unique identifier as the lookup. So until now, we've been comparing 2 lists of the same items, but hopefully it goes without saying that often is the case that the list of items you're looking up from and to might be of a different length, or might have a typo in it, or just a slightly different convention. So look what happens if I slightly change Coke to Cola for these 2 Cokes. NA appears an error against Coke on the grocery sales tab. And that's because it can't find an exact match for Cola. So the way to get around that is to use an if error function along with the VLOOKUP function. So the way to do that is to go to your syntax and type in if error in front of the VLOOKUP. So what this is saying is look up this syntax of the VLOOKUP, and if that is an error, then insert something else rather than just NA. So you can literally tell it whatever you want to pull back. So in this case, I'm going to say if there's an error that it can't find the VLOOKUP that it's looking for, and bring back find. Now, a lot of people will say to bring back 0 instead of something like can't find. And that's quite useful where you're looking up to a list which is shorter. And that might be because it's a suppressed zeros list. So on this returns data, it's a good example because you may just have a returns list where there's a positive number and not showing items which have 0 returns. So in that case, you want to bring back the 0 if there's an error and it can't find it, so that you don't have a horrible NA on your data field, and also so that you can sum the column still for your returns. But in this instance, I'm going to use can't find. And you'll see that if I drag that formula down, it now populates can't find for the Cokes because it can't find the exact match of Coke, because on the returns table I've written cola. So there are a couple of drawbacks of the VLOOKUP function you'll have noted already, but it's worth reiterating. The first one is you can only look up data to the right of the item that you're looking up, and therefore the unique identifier has got to be used to the left of the data you want to return. So in this sense, although it's more complicated, it's better to use the index and match functions. Secondly, as we've seen, if there's a duplication in the list, then it will only return data for the first of the outcomes each time. If you wanted to return a sum of all the Cokes, for example, you'd need to use a SUMIF formula. Lastly, the VLOOKUP formula can only be used if your lists are going from top to bottom, i.e. vertically. However, don't worry if you have lists whereby you want to return rows beneath the top of the column rather than to the right, because for that there's an HLOOKUP function or horizontal lookup function, which is very similar to the VLOOKUP. In more recent Excel versions, you can also use an XLOOKUP function, which is a kind of VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP combined function. Having said all that, the VLOOKUP function is really easy to use and it does get used the whole time. So if you can get used to it, it's worth learning. Bye for now and have a great day, and thanks for watching.